morning, everyone. Welcome to another program on Elaine's Extreme Paranormal channel. This morning we're having a special show in honor of Queen Anne Boleyn, who was born circa 1501 in Blickling Hall, the county of Norfolk, as history states. Anne Boleyn was the daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn, who would later become Earl of Wiltshire and Ormond, and his wife, Lady Elizabeth Howard. After living in France for a time, serving as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude, Anne returned to England in 1522. And from that point, history unfolded, but not all so favorably for Anne. Her sister Mary had already been a mistress to Henry VIII and was expecting a child whom Henry had fathered. Henry, disgruntled with his current queen, Catherine of Aragon, labeled her his Spanish cow and demanded an annulment to his marriage with her. In his petition for annulment to the Pope, he cited an excerpt from the book of Leviticus, in which he stated, "A man who takes his brother's wife shall remain childless," and claimed that he and Catherine, who was his brother's widow, would never have a son who survived infancy because their marriage was a condemnation in the eyes of God. The Roman Church refused his request. This was also the marking of the downfall of Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, who had promised a successful verdict in Henry's quest. But he failed after Cardinal Campeggio refused to agree to the annulment on the grounds that Catherine demanded a hearing by Rome and the Pope. Wolsey was disgraced and removed from Henry's office, forced to render up the Great Seal and leave the court. But Henry refused to give up on his quest to divorce Catherine and marry Anne, who was then serving as a maid of honor to Catherine. Clearly, Henry wanted Anne, and he would stop at nothing to have her. Tired of Mary as his mistress, he abandoned her, devoted all his energies to making Anne his next wife. Well, Anne, however, in the meantime, had met and fallen madly in love with Harry Percy, and was adamant that she should be allowed to marry him. Well, prior to Wolsey's downfall, the lawyer Thomas Cromwell prior to Wolsey's downfall, Henry had ordered him to inform Anne of his refusal to permit the marriage between Anne and Henry Percy. Now that Wolsey was out of the court, the lawyer, Thomas Cromwell, became the close liaison to Henry. So he encouraged Henry to form his own church, of which Henry would be head. Therefore, he could grant his own divorce and marry the Lady Anne. Henry took Cromwell's counsel to heart. He then demanded that all his subjects leave the religion of Rome and adhere instead to his new church, which he called the Church of England. Anyone who refused would be charged with treason, summarily disposed of by beheading. So, as head of his own religion, Henry considered himself free to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn, who was expecting his child at the time. The marriage was performed quickly on January the 25th, 1533, and as the coronation procession proceeded, Anne was subjected to numerous shouts of disapproval, some calling her the king's whore, some insisting that Catherine was still their proper queen. When the time came for the child to be delivered, Anne was distraught to learn that the baby was a girl. She was afraid of Henry's anger towards her. Henry was indeed angry at the birth of a so-called useless daughter. And on the encouragement of her father, Thomas Boleyn, Anne made the unlucky mistake of promising Henry a son the next time. Henry, however, soon began to tire of waiting, and once again his wandering eyes shifted to a new conquest, Jane Seymour, one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting. By January of 1534, Anne was pregnant again, but the child was either miscarried or stillborn. In 1535, she became pregnant again, but miscarried by the end of January. The child was a boy. Anne was quite upset. She blamed the miscarriage on her state of mind after hearing that Henry had taken a bad fall in jousting. She had to have known at this point that her failure to produce a living male heir was a threat to her own life, especially since the king's fancy for one of her ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, began to grow more intently. Anne's enemies at court began to plot against her, using Henry's paramours with Jane Seymour as the catalyst for their actions. Cromwell was still Henry's right-hand flunky. He swiftly began to move in to bring down Queen Anne. So he persuaded Henry to sign a document calling for an investigation that would possibly result in charges of treason and anything else they could devise. Well, on April the 30th, 1536. Anne's musician and friend for several years, Mark Smeaton, was arrested and tortured into making falsified confessions of romantic liaisons with the Queen. His tormentors promised they would spare his life if he confessed, but they lied. They had no intentions of keeping that promise. Next, Sir Henry Norris was arrested, taken to the Tower of London. Then the Queen's own brother, George Boleyn, also known as Lord Rochford, was arrested. On May the 2nd, Queen Anne herself was arrested at Greenwich and was informed of the charges against her: adultery, incest, plotting to murder the king. She was then taken to the Tower by barge along the same path she had traveled to prepare for her coronation just 3 years earlier. In fact, she was lodged in the same room she had been housed in for that occasion. Anne's daughter Elizabeth was only 3 years old. She never saw her mother again. There were several more arrests. Sir Francis Weston and William Burton were charged with adultery with the Queen. Sir Thomas Wyatt was also arrested, but later released. They were put on trial with Smeaton and Norris at Westminster Hall on May 12, 1536. Not one of the men were allowed to defend themselves, as was typically the case in charges of treason. They were conveniently declared guilty and given the required punishment as their sentence. They were to be hanged at Tyburn, cut down while still living, then disemboweled and quartered. On Monday the 15th, the Queen and her brother were put on trial at the Great Hall of the Tower of London. It's estimated that some 2,000 people attended. Anne conducted herself in a calm and dignified manner, denying all the charges against her. Her brother was tried next with his own wife, Jane Boleyn, then the Viscountess of Rochford, testifying against him. But she eventually paid the price for her lies. She got her just desserts later in the scandal of Catherine Howard, because on February 13th, 1542, Jane Boleyn was executed alongside Henry VIII's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, for her involvement in and knowledge of the Queen's affair with Thomas Culpeper. Well, even though the evidence against Queen Anne and her brother George was all fabricated, they were both declared guilty, sentence being read by their uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk. They were to be either burned at the stake, which was punishment for incest, or beheaded at the discretion of the king, or as the saying was in that time period, until the king's pleasure be known. On May 17th, 1536, George Boleyn was executed on Tower Hill. The other 4 men, condemned with the Queen, had their sentences commuted from the grisly fate of being hung, drawn, and quartered at Tyburn to a so-called simple beheading at the Tower with Lord Rochford. Well, Anne knew that her time would soon come. She often became hysterical, her behavior swinging from great levity to body-racking sobs. She received news that an expert swordsman from Calais had been summoned, who would no doubt deliver a cleaner blow with a sharp sword than the traditional axe. Interestingly, shortly before her execution on charges of adultery, the Queen's marriage to the king was dissolved and declared invalid, claiming Anne's daughter Elizabeth to be a bastard child. Well, one would then wonder, how could she have committed adultery if she in fact had never been married to Henry? But this was overlooked, as were so many other lapses of logic in the charges against Anne. When Anne's time to be executed came, she again conducted herself with dignity. She asked the people to pray for her, Henry, as well as herself. Had she dared say anything otherwise, there's no doubt Henry would have imprisoned and executed her remaining family members. Anne was no fool. While she had the spunk to speak up to Henry during their quarrels, she knew that this was neither the time nor the place to say anything else. As Anne ascended the steps of the scaffold, the lecherous lawyer, Thomas Cromwell, looked on with great pride and satisfaction in knowing that he had finally brought Queen Anne down. Well, he fared no better himself later on, however, when he arranged another marriage for Henry after Jane Seymour died. Well, Henry was so angry at Cromwell when he married him off to Anne of Cleves that he dismissed him from his court. He later had Cromwell's head chopped off by the axe on July 28, 1540. Just as Queen Anne Boleyn had been unjustly accused and falsely declared guilty along with her brother George, Thomas Cromwell had been denied a real trial. Instead, an act of attainder had been used against him. He was accused of many things, including usurping authority he didn't have, undermining Henry's decisions, treason, misusing and appropriating funds not of his right, taking bribes, and utter heresy. So his disreputable act of having Queen Anne denied her rights fell right back on his shoulders, and he lost his own head too. After Anne met her fate by his lies and those of Henry's court, her body and head were put into an arrow chest and buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel at St. Peter ad Vincula, which adjoined the Tower Green. Her body was one that was identified in renovations of the chapel under the reign of Queen Victoria, so Anne's final resting place is now marked in the marble floor. Queen Anne's spirit has been witnessed in several places since her cruel and untimely demise. Blickling Hall, where she was born, Hampton Court, where she lived after Wolsey had been disgraced and removed from court. Wolsey, incidentally, had been summoned for arrest and trial by Henry, but he died en route. Queen Anne has also been seen in the Tower of London. Some say she walks headless, carrying her head under one arm. Still others maintain that she appears fully intact. Some reports claim she stares coldly at those who see her. Other reports indicate that she smiles and simply walks on by. It never ceases to amaze me how those very same cowards who arranged Queen Anne's downfall, her arrest, her mock trial, and murder all met their own fates. This is what makes me wonder. Could it be that Anne was somehow able to see to it that they received just penalty for their disgusting lies against her? Her daughter Elizabeth was crowned queen after the death of Henry's daughter with Catherine of Aragon, Mary. Mary, widely remembered for her callous murders of hundreds of innocent people who refused to adhere to the Roman religion at her command, was latterly known as Bloody Mary. She called Elizabeth that bastard of the Queen Boleyn. Mary died at St. James's Palace in London on November the 17th, 1558. She was weak, chronically sick from May of that year to her death, possibly from either ovarian cysts or uterine cancer. She was only 42 years of age. When she died, there was also an influenza epidemic, and she was interred at Westminster Abbey. Her half-sister, Elizabeth, succeeded her on the throne as Elizabeth I in 1559. On Elizabeth's death in 1603, she was buried alongside Mary. So just for personal feelings, in remembrance of Queen Anne Boleyn, my strong impression is that her only mistake was wanting to be the Queen of England at all costs. I refused to accept the charges levied against her, and I admired how she handled herself against her enemies, how she conducted herself after the conspired accusations, and went to her death without implicating the remainder of her family, simply because Henry wanted to be rid of her and another of his typical childish temper tantrums. Blaming Anne for not giving him a son was ridiculous. And in that era, it was not known that the father's genes decide whether or not the child born would be male or female. So in honor of Queen Anne Boleyn, here are some EVPs that I've collected as I was trying to contact Queen Anne Boleyn. And this is taken from several sessions that I used the spirit box with. And I hope that I've amplified them loudly enough that you can hear them. Here's the first one that I've got, where a person tells me he can't talk. Well, that was pretty interesting. I kind of got a bang out of that. Then I heard hello, and so I replied back. Oh dear. Now there's another here. It's the same question. If there was anyone there who wanted to speak to me, I heard yes. Hello. This one's not really the clearest, but just the same. I'll play it for you. See if you can hear it. I hope so. Yes and hello. Okay, now the fourth one. This was also quite interesting due to the fact that I asked if Queen Anne Boleyn was available. This is the reply that I got. She's left. Now that was pretty interesting, I must admit. But anyway. Okay, the next one we've got, this particular EVP I kind of got a bang out of too. It seems that whoever he is, he has a sense of humor. Because I ask, as usual, when I start out on a session with the spirit box, usually always I ask, is there anyone there who would like to say hello to me? And I got a rather firm but decisive answer. No, a very firm, but however. Okay, so that was the answer that I got. And those are just some of the EVPs that I've been trying to get hold of Queen Anne Boleyn in. So anyway, enough of my personal feelings. I'm sure there are an awful lot of people who feel the same way, that Queen Anne Boleyn was unjustly tried, unfairly executed. So, in her honor, here's to you, Queen Anne Boleyn. I know, in Canada, you're not supposed to be seen having, well, you could be seen having wine or other spirits on the air, but you're not supposed to be seen drinking them. But this is a private show. Here's to you, Queen Anne. May your spirit rest in peace, and may you be cleared totally of all those false charges laid against you. Thanks for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed the show. And please remember, our theme song is Only You. It's only for you that we put this show on. Only for you viewers. So bye for now, everybody. Take care. God bless.